whole book. And then in more detail, we say progressive faith in God's all-sufficiency in the midst of the years. Now later we'll go into detail more as to what is meant by the midst of the years. But here's the diagram which I use for Habakkuk. It shows the truth of progressive faith. You have the heart, and then into 3 steps leading upward. On the bottom step you have your question mark, as Habakkuk brings his questions to the Lord. Then on the second you have the arrow pointing upward. He takes his position on the watchtower. And remember that watchtower is a superlative illustration. What it means is that he is watching watchfully for God's answer. You couldn't have a stronger illustration for watchfulness than that. Because just as the sentinel is responsible for watching out for the welfare of the city, so Habakkuk takes that same position. That's why I call it a superlative illustration. And then on the top step, we have the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk. And that 3rd chapter is just the musical scale. And then on that musical scale, we write the double F, fortissimo. That is, it's a victorious song. It's a song of victory in the midst of terrific circumstances. All right, now that's our general plan of the book of Habakkuk. And then the 3rd chapter we just call victorious singing in the midst of the years. This song is sometimes called a historico prophetical song. Now you see what is meant by that hyphenated word, historico prophetical psalm. That is, it looks back at the past at what God has done. That's the major part of it. Then it says, revive thy work in the midst of the years. The Babylonian captivity has not yet come, but he's looking into the future for the Babylonian captivity. And he says, in the midst of the years of the Babylonian captivity, revive thy miracle work. That's why we call it a historical, prophetical psalm. The deliverance from Egypt. That takes you back into the past. And then you say, deliverance from Babylon. No, not deliverance from Babylon, not yet. Deliverance in the midst of Babylon. You see, God's people knew how long the Babylonian captivity was going to last. 3 times in the book of Jeremiah, you have the idea of 70 years. Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12. 70 years, 70 years. Jeremiah 25, 11 and 12. And then Jeremiah 29, verse 10. God says, after 70 years, I'll bring you back again. Many Bible historians have called attention to the fact that from a twofold standpoint, the Babylonian captivity lasted for 70 years. 606 BC is the date commonly accepted for the first section of Judah's captivity. You know, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah and took them into captivity in 3 sections. And the first was in 606 BC. And then 70 years later is 536 BC, which is the Edict of Cyrus. The Edict of Cyrus gives God's people permission to go back from the land of Babylonian captivity. So you see, you have 70 years from the first exit from the land to the first re-entrance into the land. And then many take 586 BC, which is the destruction of the temple under Nebuchadnezzar, and then go on to 516 BC. And 516 BC is the rebuilding of the temple. You see, they came back in 536. They got cold feet, and for a long, long time they delayed. Finally, in 516 BC, they rededicated the temple after it was built. So that Babylonian captivity lasted for 70 years from 2 standpoints, from 606 to 536 and from 586 to 516. So this is not deliverance from Babylonian captivity. It's deliverance in the midst of Babylonian captivity. captivity. I'll never know the meaning of deliverance from if I don't know the meaning of deliverance in. You say, oh, if God would just deliver me from these circumstances, deliver me these things. The main thing I need is not to be delivered from them. The main thing I need is to be delivered in the midst of them. God works the miracle in my heart. And that's what you have here, victorious singing in the midst of the year. One thing that makes this truth so precious is that the people were to sing victoriously before the answer came. You say, well, after the answer comes, then we're going to have special praise meeting. We're going to praise the Lord in great triumph. But see, I'll never really know the meaning of victorious singing after the deliverance. If I don't know the meaning of victorious singing before the deliverance comes. In order to make this real, just stop for a moment and think of one or two of the biggest needs, biggest difficulties in your own life at the present time. You say, oh, I tell you, I really would join in victorious praise to the Lord after He delivered me from this. No, victorious singing now before you see any sign He's delivering you from this. See, you know how we naturally would have sung the third chapter. We would have sung the third chapter double P rather than double F. Only we musicians know the meaning of these terms. So for the hoi polloi, I'll have to stop and explain, you know. Double P, of course, means sing it very softly. Double F, fortissimo, sing it very loudly. You see, naturally I think, well, I'll sing now to the Lord double P very softly. Then I'll sing double F after deliverance comes. No, you see, this is singing double F before the deliverance comes. It's in the midst of it. And that's why we call victorious singing in the midst of the year. Every difficulty God allows in your life is just another opportunity to sing victoriously in the midst of the years. Not after the years are over, but in the midst of the year. Explain the meaning of the underscored words in each of the following. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet set to Shigionoth. Now over the word Shigionoth, just write music. Set to music. There are many different explanations of that word. I used to think I wish everybody would accept mine because mine ties in with the thing that I'm emphasizing. But I don't need the word Shigionoth to get that. The idea of victorious praise. One interpretation of it is that Shigionoth comes from Shigion, S-I-G-G-A-I-O-N, which means to cry, and Shigionoth is just the plural form, loud crying. Many give that. But you see, that ties right in with your double F. Set Shigionoth. Sing it loudly, sing it loudly. But not all interpreters accept that. Thirtle and some others. By the way, Thirtle on the Lord's Prayer is considered one of the great works on the Lord's Prayer. Any of you ever find that? I'd like to get a copy of it. Because many quote from it, but I've never had a copy of it myself. But Thirtle, he was one of these old-time Puritans, I think. He must have had some tremendous things. I know that from the quotes I've read from him. He thinks that Shigionoth means for adversity. Well, that's one explanation. Then Fawcett and others say to wander. Well, how would you get to wander? See, he wanders here from triumph to tragedy to triumph again, back and forth. So not all agree as to the exact meaning, but all agree in general that it's a sign of the musical scale. It was set to music. In other words, this was a prayer hymn. Do you preachers lay great stress in your work for the Lord on prayer hymns? My pastor, Dr. King, was great on that. I don't think I ever attended a service Sunday morning or Sunday night that he didn't have a prayer hymn. And sometimes he'd say, now we'll pray together, and you'd expect everybody to bow his head, the pastor to lead the prayer, but then he'd add singing. And of course, not all the hymns are prayer hymns, but many of them are. Jesus, keep me near the cross, there a precious fountain. And you see, when you announce it's a prayer hymn, it just helps to get the whole group into the spirit of it in a little bit different way. You say, well, you're supposed to be praying. Yeah, you're supposed to be. But you know, so many go to church Sunday morning and really they're so anxious for the preacher to stop on time so they get home and watch the football game on television. And if he goes just a second beyond, you know, they don't even know what he's talking about. They're way out there on the football gridiron already. See? And we need to give people every help to concentrate. Not enough to fuss at them. You know, a lot of preachers fuss at them. Now, you didn't pay any attention to those words. I say, brother preacher, why didn't you help those folks pay attention to those words? Why don't you give them something that'll help them to do it? And one thing that helps is just this, the prayer hymn. And this is a prayer hymn, and that's what I get out of that word, Shigiana, set to music. One indication of the fact that this was set to music is that you have the word Selah, S-E-L-A-H. That word Selah occurs 74 times in the Old Testament. And all but 3 of those 74 times are in the book of Psalms, 71. There are 3 times you have Selah outside Psalms. And all 3 of them are in this 3rd chapter. Now, almost volumes have been written about Selah. Nobody's certain about some of the things concerning it. But in general, Bible commentators agree that it had something to do with the musical scale. Therefore, when I read Selah, I just say sing. Sing. My pastor at home preached a sermon, and I'm sure it was a good sermon, wonderful sermon, as I think his sermons in general were, but he just took an absolute stand. It means think of that. You probably heard some folks say, Selah, think of that. Selah, think of that, think of that. Well, I took my concordance one time and I ran that word down. Concordance, the 74 times it occurred, or many of those times, and I found that sometimes it had to do with a very startling statement. Yeah, Selah, think of that. Sometimes it had to do with a very commonplace statement, where think of that wouldn't be the idea at all. It's just like I walk downstairs, Selah. Say I walk downstairs, think of that. See, no, you know, a man who preaches oftentimes likes to get something that's very striking and ties in with what he has in his own mind and tries to tie the Bible into his sermon. You know, rather than tying your sermon into the Bible. Don't think I haven't done it. And of course, I have that temptation because you see, I'm teaching through these books. And one thing, when a preacher's preaching, preach something especially on his heart. Well, the point is, I'm teaching this book, and I've got to get what's in that book on my heart. It's a different thing. Work both ways. That's one reason why I like the preaching and why I like the teaching. I think each one makes a contribution that the other thing does not make. But whenever you read that word Selah, just stop and say, sing, sing. Sometimes you'll have a very sad verse, and then Selah. What you got to sing about. God told you to sing. Go ahead and sing. Sad. Then sometimes you have a very joyful verse. Say, oh yeah, I'm ready to sing about it. Yeah, sing about that. Philippians 4:11-13, you know, Paul says, I've learned how to be a base, and I know how to abound. See, every Christian should know both things. You know, some really think it's virtuous. If you sit down to a meal, you can't even enjoy your meal because you know some people are dying of starvation. Well, after all, if you don't enjoy the meal, how's that going to help them if you don't enjoy your meal? I know Dr. Cook had told us once, illustrating Philippians 4:11-13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I know how to be a base. I know how to abound. And he said he had 2 meetings very shortly, one after the other. And he said in one, he stayed in a big home, just a beautiful home. And he had private baths and everything that he wanted, you know. And he said, I just thoroughly enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed it. He said, then I had another meeting and I stayed with a couple in their trailer. He said it wasn't exactly the same, but he said, I can tell you honestly, I enjoyed that second just as much as the first. Well, it's important to enjoy the first, important to enjoy the second. Sing. Sing. And that's what I get out of that word Selah. Some have asked the question, should you, in the public reading of the Bible, read the word Selah? You see, it's a part of the musical scale. Did you read it? I say, yeah. Read it. tell folks what it means. Sing. Is your heart singing to the Lord right now, right where you are? What about you folks in class tonight? Seal up. Sing. They occurs 3 times in the 3rd chapter of the Bible. And nowhere else in the Bible except those 71 times in the book of Psalms. O Jehovah, I have heard the report of thee, and am afraid. O Jehovah, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. Now, King James says, make known. Make it known. What does it refer to? See, it means his miracle work. Revive thy miracle work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. In order to get the meaning here, would you just insert some words? After the word years, insert the 3 words of Babylonian captivity. See, this is to prepare the remnant for the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. That's what he means by in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years of the Babylonian captivity. Then revive thy work. Before the word work, insert the word miracle, and then put a hyphen after it. Revive thy miracle work in the midst of the years of the Babylonian captivity. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. He's praying here not for just some work of God. This is the way this is often misinterpreted. No less a person than Spurgeon does that. I read his sermon on that, and I think I got less out of Spurgeon's sermon on that one thing than any of his sermons I read in the last few years. I think he missed the point on that. He took this as a prayer for revival. I don't think this is a prayer for revival. Revive thy work in the midst of the years. This is the prayer for the revival of God's miracle work before the revival comes. When did the revival come? Well, the revival really came after the time of the Babylonian captivity. 70 years. You see, you have your return under Zerubbabel, and then your return under Ezra, and then your return under Nehemiah. You know, Judah was carried into captivity in 3 sections. Judah came back from captivity in 3 sections. They came back over a period of nearly 100 years. 93 years, to be exact, between the first return under Zerubbabel and then the last return under Nehemiah. And the revival hadn't come yet. So this is not a prayer for revival. This is a prayer for the reviving of God's miracle work before revival comes. Here's one of the greatest hindrances to revival. One of the greatest hindrances to revival is failure to trust God for his miracle work before the revival comes. Many preachers pray, oh, well, we just pray nothing but revival. But revival, don't you dare think of that. God isn't confined to revival for his working. Indeed not. He wasn't then. I think I reminded you last time that this was so appropriate for Daniel and his friends in the land of Babylonian captivity. Daniel chapter 3 and Daniel chapter 6. By the way, we say Daniel was praying and Daniel's friends were praying. Yeah, and then you have the wonderful miracle, Daniel 3, the friends of Daniel in the fire furnace. And then Daniel 6, Daniel in the lion's den. But you see, they weren't the only ones praying. The godly remnant was praying. The godly remnant was praying this very thing. Revive thy miracle work in the midst of the years. And oh, did God ever do it? You read the book of Daniel and you'll see he's lived in the midst of the years. He lived in the midst of the years. And you say, revival hadn't come. No, they weren't back yet. They hadn't come back yet. But God wasn't waiting until they came back and the revival came. He revived his miracle work in the midst of the years of Babylonian captivity. And one reason that is such a strong statement is that the Babylonian captivity was the greatest spiritual depression the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah had ever known. And if God can send miracle working in the midst of the greatest spiritual depression that Israel's ever known, he revive His work in the midst of the years, no matter what spiritual depression may be. You preachers take your own church. You pray for revival in your church. But one of your greatest hindrances in praying for revival for your church is that you don't expect God to work in the midst of the years before the revival comes. Oh, there's the point. And I do believe that Spurgeon missed the main point of that. He's praying for revival. Sure, it's right to pray for revival. Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? But that's not what this is talking about. And again, may I say, one of the greatest hindrances to revival is failure to trust God for His miracle work in the midst of the years of captivity before the revival comes. All right, I asked you in order to enter into this to insert two words or expressions. After years of Babylonian captivity. And then thy work, thy miracle work. Well, did God ever do it? My, what a thrilling story that is. The friends of Daniel in the fiery furnace. It came out, it was heated 7 times as hot as it was ordinary to heat. And it wasn't even the smell of smoke on their garments. I heard a preacher illustrating that one time. He said that his beloved life companion, before he went home to be with the Lord, passed through 2 years of tremendous suffering. I think she died of cancer. Passed through 2 tremendous years of suffering. And he said she came through those years of suffering and there wasn't even the smell of smoke on her garments. Wasn't even the smell of smoke on her garments. Oh, how tremendous that is. Well, all that's an answer to prayer. And it wasn't just Daniel's prayer. It wasn't just the friends of Daniel as they prayed. It was the godly remnant. And they were praying. I wonder if Daniel in the lion's den prayed this very prayer when he was in the lion's den. I don't know. But I do know it was very appropriate for him and for the others in that time of Babylonian captivity. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Perak. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of His praise. And His brightness was as the light. He had rays coming forth from His hand, and there was the hiding of His power. I just mentioned that last time, and that is, these words mean that these wonderful things are only a little sample of what God is able to do. They're just a little sample. You say, my, those mighty things that He recounts. The sun stood still. Well, that's one thing that's mentioned here. The sun stood still. You say, would anything be greater than that? That's just the sampling of His power. That's just the hiding of God's power. Think of it in your own life. Anything you've witnessed God doing, it's only the hiding of His power. You look back at the days of a person like George Whitfield, or men of God like John Wesley and Charles Wesley. You say, oh, could we even expect anything like that today? Well, the answer is that was just the hiding of God's power. That wasn't the demonstration of it, just the hiding. I told you, I think it was last time, a quotation from Spurgeon. Spurgeon was quoting from somebody else. It sounded like one of the old Puritans. Spurgeon sort of lived in the writings of these old Puritans. He quoted often from them. And he said, even the clearest revelation of God is a concealment. And he used another word from him. Even the clearest revelation is an obfuscation. Have you ever seen that word? Revelation, make it clear. Obfuscation. O-B-V-E-L-A-T-I-O-N. And then he just translated it, concealment. Will you be able to say that when you're in heaven, after you've been in heaven for 100 years? You know, many people have the idea heaven's like this. You're in heaven and then you just get everything you're going to get. All like that. No, heaven's not like that. Heaven's like this. It gets better and better all the time. I like the word bester and bester. It gets bester and bester all the time. What's the proof of that? The proof of that is the infinity of God. Infinity means He's unlimited. He's unlimited. And after you've been in heaven for 100 years, you'll say, this is the hiding of His power. You say, oh, that's the full manifestation. No, that's not the full manifestation. That's the hiding of His power. But then after you've been there 1,000,000 years, you'll be able to say, that's an obligation. That's a revelation, that's an obligation. You see, you get that from the infinity of God. Remember, there is no such thing as a hyperbole when you're describing God. You know, a hyperbole is legitimate exaggeration. You can't go beyond that. He's unlimited. He's unlimited. He's the infinite God. And that's one reason I love this expression. There was the hiding of his power. In a moment, we're going back to some of those great things that God did in the days of the Exodus, leading Israel into Canaan. And remember, this is just a hiding of his power. This is an obligation. It is not a full revelation. Jehovah the Lord is my strength, and he maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and will make me to walk upon my high places. Now you see what this means. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and will make me to walk upon my high places. The hind was the female deer. And one characteristic of the feet of the female deer is sure-footedness. The female deer, even more than the male deer, has sure-footedness. Many people in Palestine have called attention to the fact that they frequently seen the hind, the female deer, walking on precipitous places almost like a cliff. And said it just looked like the hind would fall off the cliff. But it didn't fall off the cliff, because God did something to the feet that gave sure-footedness in the midst of very precipitous, very dangerous places. I think the verse can be summarized in these words: the Lord gives me sure-footedness in the midst of very dangerous places. That's what he's saying. The Lord gives me sure-footedness in the midst of very dangerous places. You see, Habakkuk brings his questions to the Lord and then stands on the watchtower of faith. And not everything changes all at once. Not at all. But God does something to his feet. God hadn't promised to change your places. God promised to do something to your feet. God hadn't promised to change my places, but he's promised to do something to my feet. Generally speaking, I took this position when I taught at the Bible college, that it was better for a student who was involved in a course to go on with that course and fail the course if he had to, rather than drop out. I call it spiritual dropsy. You have that in any school. So, like Christian service opportunity. Somebody's assigned to a particular Christian service opportunity, and he goes to the head of the Christian service department and says, please change. I'm just not designed for that. I'm not designed for that. The point is, if that's God's assignment for me, then I expect him to do something to my feet in the midst of those precipitous places. And one reason why this figure means so much to me is that I have a form of dizziness in high places that I'm very careful when I get in those high places. I have an inward urge to jump from a high place. I don't know how many of you have. Somebody told me once that's a form of insanity. If it is, I'm insane because I have it. But somebody told me once he thought about half the people in the world had that inward urge to jump. I'm awfully glad I have another inward urge not to jump. Many years ago, back in 1937, I went out to California to see my sister. Her husband was in the Air Force, the Naval Air Force, and was located at Coronado, California, just across the bay from San Diego. And he took me up in the plane, open cockpit plane. Oh, I came down to that. I felt like the fellow who went up the plane, came down, he said, thank you for both of those rides, my first and my last. That's the way I felt about it. I had that inward urge to jump. We were just up 20 minutes. Seemed to me like an eternity. Boy, open cockpit where he was in front and I was behind him. You know that old-timey thing? Never again. I've been up in planes, you know, flying commercially. Different then, because you don't have to think too much about where you're going to jump, because you have to bust the wind out and probably not get out of it then, you know. It's a different thing, but I thought, never again. We were up 20 minutes, and one thing he did was he started to stunt with it. And he turned like this, real sharply. And I yelled so loud, he heard me over the motor, over the place. And he said, but I was looking there, and if you're taking it all right, I was going to loop the loop. Isn't that what they call it? You go all the way over it. I believe if he had, I'd die. That inverter, before I went up, I had to sign papers saying that in case of accident or death, the Navy would not be responsible. That was my send-off, you know. Sure, they do that kind of thing. And then, all around, I felt like a stuffed toad. Had this parachute all around me. And he gave me instructions on how to pull the cord and everything, you know. Man, I could no more have done that than flying. You know, all that going through my mind with that inward urge of jump. You know, I held on to the side of that thing so long that really my hands were sore for several days after that. That's the truth. That's the truth. And another time I was up Radio City, New York, on the 65th floor. 65th floor, sightseeing. How many of you have been up there? You've been up there? Boy, if you haven't, you ain't been nowhere and seen nothing. You know, it really is up there. And the guide was calling attention to various things, and some people were just about leaning over like this. Had a balcony in front of you. I think it was made of concrete. And some of them were leaning over looking out and said, boy, I wasn't. I tell you. I was back right there. Scared to death. I was going to jump. Well, I can appreciate this very much because Habakkuk's talking about it. He's saying, God's done something to my feet. And I trust him all the time to do something to my feet, to enable me to walk in precipitous places. You see, this is the heart and core of a true missionary. And this is the heart and core of a true Christian. Not one who just expects God to change his places. No. But one that will trust the Lord to work mightily on his feet in the midst of those precipitous places. So just to summarize it, I think that's what he's saying. The Lord gives me sure-footedness in the midst of very dangerous places. On page 108, I've asked you to summarize briefly the following verses from Habakkuk 3 to 15. God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Perim. His glory covered the heavens. The earth was full of his praise. His brightness was as the light. He had rays coming forth from his hand, and there was the hiding of his power. Before him went the pestilence, and fiery bolts went forth at his feet. He stood and measured the earth. He beheld and drove asunder the nations, and the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills did bow. His goings words of old. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was Jehovah displeased with the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Or thy wrath against the sea? Thou didst ride upon thy horses, upon thy chariots of salvation. Thy bow was made quite bare. The oaths to the tribes were a sure word. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. The mountains saw thee and were afraid. The tempest of waters passed by. The deep uttered its voice, lifted up its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation at the light of thine arrows as they went at the shining of thy glittering spears. You see this strongly figurative language, this beautiful voice. The sun and moon stood still. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. Thou didst thresh the nations in anger. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, for the salvation of thine anointed. Thou woundest the head out of the house of the wicked man, laying bare the foundation, even unto the neck. Thou didst pierce with his own staves the head of his warriors. They came as a whirlwind to scatter him. Their rejoicing was as to devour the poor secretly. Thou didst tread the sea with thy horses, the heap of mighty waters. These wonderful verses can be summarized in very simple words. The very simple words are God's salvation march from Egypt to Canaan. I think that's the whole message. God's salvation march from Egypt to Canaan. You see why I call it God's salvation march. In your notes, I want you to circle that word salvation the 3 times it occurs. First, you're near the middle of the paragraph, right on the end of the sentence. Thy chariots of salvation. Draw a circle around the word salvation. And then come down just a few lines from the bottom of the paragraph, and twice you'll find in the same line the word salvation. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, for the salvation of thine anointed. This is God's salvation march from Egypt to Canaan. See, what did God do in order to take his people out of Egyptian bondage and victoriously into the land of Canaan? That's the subject here. And he calls it a salvation march. In the margin here, just circle the word march. A couple of lines up above salvation. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. So I call it God's salvation march. In the margin, just write chapter 1, verse 6. Chapter 1, verse 6 tells about the Babylonian march. That very word march is used. It says God has raised up the Chaldeans and they marched through the land. Chapter 1, verse 6. See, that's the march of destruction. The Babylonian march of destruction. Now when you come to the 3rd chapter, you have God's salvation march. God's march of salvation. It's a wonderful thing to realize that every time in human history you have man's march of destruction. Hidden behind it all is God's march of salvation. God is marching in salvation. I think a good illustration of this is the marching of the German troops during World War II. They marched in what they called goose step. You've seen pictures, Pathé News, from way back to past. When I was up in Roanoke, I saw these pictures from World War II called The World at War. It wasn't dramatic pictures, it was just Pathé News, what we used to call it years ago, just nude pictures, and showed pictures of these German soldiers, and they were trained in how to do it. They did it in unison, goose stepping. It was just a way to insult people and remind them of German power. And that's what you have here in chapter 1, verse 6, the Babylonian march of destruction. But when those German troops were marching like that, God was there with his salvation march. He makes the wrath of man to praise him. I think you have one great illustration of this in Japan. The Japanese warlord, Pearl Harbor, and all that kind of thing. I was just reading yesterday something the person gave me that in 1942, the Marines on Iwo Jima Island planted the picture. You've seen it often, Old Glory on Iwo Jima Island, 1942. You see, that was not too long after the start of the war. And that sort of started us back the other way after the Japanese had gotten the victory. But I remember during the war we asked some missionary from Japan, suppose we do defeat the Japanese, will they listen to us when we talk about Christ? And he said, yes, they will. He said, post-war Japan will be very different because America will be in charge. General Douglas MacArthur was just almost a national hero over there after the war because of the kindly way in which he treated the Japanese. I think they've sort of forgotten the way we treated them, and I'm very sure they wouldn't have treated us the same way if they'd conquered America. But Japan was open to the gospel. Many missionary societies just ask, please come and help us take advantage of it. Come and take advantage of it. Because this war has opened the gospel. You see, here's the march of the Japanese, the march of destruction. But behind that, God's marching in salvation. God's marching in salvation. And now, in order to enter into the message of this great song, I want you to notice some of the attributes of God that are revealed. First, up at the top, just circle the word glory. His glory covered the heavens. Now, I think it's accurate to say that glory is not one attribute of God, but it's the sum total of all God's attributes. I like to call the word glory shorthand for everything that God is. Those of you who've been in the classes with me know how often I stress Exodus 33:18. Show me thy glory. That's not one attribute of God. That's the sum total of everything God is, and he starts with glory. And then he gives us the breakdown on other attributes or other characteristics of God. Sometimes when I pray, I take the breakdown on it. Show me thy glory. And then I just pray, show me thy glorious holiness. Show me thy glorious love. Show me thy glorious omnipotence. Show me thy glorious omnipresence. Show me thy glorious omniscience. Show me thy glorious unchangeableness. Show me thy glorious wrath. See, God is glorious in all his different attributes. And you start off with God's glory. Then, 3 or 4 lines down, just circle the word power. And there's where your greatest emphasis is given in this, on the glorious power of God. I love Numbers 14:11 that I got especially from John Watson, one of the old Puritans. Numbers 14:11, let the power of the Lord be great. Let the power of the Lord be great. John Watson said, it's his book on the Lord's Prayer. He said, what attribute of God is especially involved when the Lord forgives your sins? And you say, his grace, his mercy. Yes, but he says, Numbers 14:11 mentions the power. You read it in its setting. Numbers 14:11, Moses prays. And why does he pray, let the power of the Lord be great? In forgiving sin. That's the whole context. That's the whole context. I was thinking recently of that great song of William R. Newell at Calvary. And he says, oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. Yes, but oh, the power that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the power that brought it down to man. See, these attributes of God are not like this. They're like this. They're intertwined with one another. And the great emphasis in this song is on God's mighty power, his glorious power. But don't limit that when the Bible doesn't limit it. Then about the middle of the passage, you have the word oath. The oaths to the tribe were a sure word. Isn't that a great verse? Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say the promises to the tribe were a sure word. He doesn't say the promises to the tribe were a sure word. He says the oath. You see, that's a stronger word. Every time God promises, God puts himself on oath. We say the Bible's filled with wonderful promises. Yeah, but the other way to state it is the Bible's filled with wonderful oaths. God puts himself on oath. And one thing that sustained Habakkuk, and one thing that sustained the godly remnant in the Babylonian captivity was that God was on oath. God was on oath with his people. And that's the revelation of God as the faithful God. And he emphasizes his faithfulness through his oath. And then a few lines from the bottom, just circle the word anger. God's glorious anger. God's glorious anger. All right, now summarize this for a moment. These wonderful verses have to do with God's salvation march from Egypt to Canaan. See, not his march of destruction. The salvation march, a lot of destruction along the way. Sure, he destroyed Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. He destroyed the Canaanites when God's people invaded Canaan. But this was not a march of destruction. It was a march of salvation. It was a march of salvation. God's salvation march. Contrast it with chapter 1, verse 6. The Babylonian march of destruction. But God's great victorious march of salvation. Then you start off with the glory, which summarizes everything. The sum total of everything that God is. And then you go on to his power, to his faithfulness, and to his anger. Show how this third chapter of Habakkuk helps us to understand the entire Old Testament. You'll see how the third chapter helps us to understand the Old Testament if you mark these words, which occur 6 or 7 lines from the end of the paragraph in this preceding question. Just mark these in some emphatic way. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, for the salvation of thine anointed. Now these words show what God is doing throughout Old Testament history. He's going forth for the salvation of his people, for the salvation of his anointed. And they also show what God is doing through all history. This is what God is doing today. When you read the newspapers, what's taking place, you say, here's what man's doing, what God's doing. Come back to Habakkuk 3 and you'll find out what God is doing. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, for the salvation of thine anointed. I've told some of you that I have this little devotional book in which I write what I call dynamite verses. I like to be sure when I'm ready to teach a class or to preach a sermon or to do something God's called me to do, that my soul is believing God for that time. When you have your quiet time, what's the main thing you have in mind? In my quiet time, the main thing I have in mind is to be sure my soul is believing God for that day. That's the main thing I have. You say you come to meet God and see Him and all, but this is the main thing I have in mind in my own quiet time. To be sure that my soul is believing God for that day. And that's why I have a lot of these dynamite verses. And one of those dynamite verses is Psalm 74, verse 12. It helps me to enter into the message of Habakkuk 3. I want to ask a favor of you, and the favor is that when you go back home tonight, and not later than tomorrow sometime, read the 74th Psalm. Because the 74th Psalm is really the same message as Habakkuk chapter 3. Chapter 74, verse 12 says, Yet God is my King of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. Wow, that's a tremendous thing. What's God doing in the world today? He's working salvation in the midst of the earth. You see what man's doing. Well, we read that in the newspaper. Yeah, but what God's doing? God is working salvation in the midst of the earth. That's what this song is talking about here. He said, it doesn't look like it. No, remember, that's where faith comes in. You look and you say, the newspapers tell me what seems to be taking place. The Bible tells me what's actually taking place. The thing that's actually taking place is that God is working salvation in the midst of the earth. Go back in your mind to the Middle Ages. Before Martin Luther, John Huss, Martin Luther, and some of the others came on the scene. You say, here's what the Catholic religion's doing. Yeah, that's what the Catholic religion is doing, but God's doing something. God's working salvation in the midst of the earth. He's always busy. Brother Jim teaching the prophets in his class on Tuesday night, we were talking about Ezekiel's vision. You know, Ezekiel saw the wheel, and the Negro spiritual misses the point of that. It says the little wheel run by faith, the big wheel run by the grace of God. You know, the wheel within the wheel, I don't know what I was talking about. Not talking about one bigger wheel and a little wheel inside. No, these are intersecting wheels. The idea is, in vision, he sees these wheels of God's glorious activity. See, Ezekiel's a great prophet of God's glory, of God's glorious activity. They're moving in all directions all the time. See, that's where he starts. He's in the land of captivity by the river Shebar. Shebar is evidently a canal leading from the Euphrates River. And he's there. And, oh, God isn't doing anything. Yeah, the wheels of God's glorious activity are moving all the time. All the time. While you're here in class tonight, that's true. God's working salvation in the midst of you. Boy, that keeps you from a pessimistic approach. And some premillennialists have gotten into that. said, you can't expect anything to happen till Jesus comes again. Brother, I can't read Habakkuk 3 and find that out. Indeed you can. God is working salvation in the midst of the earth. Another verse from that 74th Psalm that helps me so much is 74:22, which says, Arise, O God, plead thine own cause. Psalm 74:22. Arise, O God, plead thine own cause. You ever pray that? Oh, I just love to pray it over and over. All right, summarize for just a moment. God's salvation mark from Egypt's kingdom. And what is he doing? Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, the salvation of thine anointing. That's the key to Old Testament history. That's the key to New Testament history. That's the key to all history. God is going forth for the salvation of his own. All right, let's have our prayer. Down at the bottom of page 108, I've asked you to read carefully Habakkuk 3, verses 16 to 19. I heard and my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness enters into my bones, and I tremble in my place, because I must wait quietly for the day of trouble, for the coming up of the people in invasion. In other words, Habakkuk believed his own prophecy. Earlier, he said the Chaldeans were going to invade. He believed his own prophecy, and when he believed his own prophecy, he quivered. He just shook from head to foot at what was going to happen. Now watch this. For though the fig tree shall not flourish, neither shall fruit be in the vine, the labor of the olive shall fail, the field shall yield no food, the flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Those things, of course, happen especially in times of invasion. When your troops are coming in, they eat a lot of it themselves, and then they burn up the rest. So this is just showing what's going to happen in the land of Palestine after the Babylonians have consumed everything. Yet I will rejoice in Jehovah. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Jehovah the Lord is my strength, and maketh my feet like hinds feet, and will make me to walk upon my high places. How are these verses a wonderful conclusion to the book of Habakkuk? In at least two ways, they're a wonderful conclusion. The first is they record the climax of the prophet's faith. They record the climax of the prophet's faith. To start off, he's on the watchtower of faith after he's brought his questions to the Lord, looking for the answer. But then the climax of the faith comes in these words. Though the fig tree shall not flourish. Now let me just paraphrase it and say, for though the greatest calamity should take place. That's what he's saying. See why I say, though the greatest calamity should take place. Because these were the greatest calamities that could happen to Judah, because Judah was an agricultural people. You see, if something like this happened to us in America, it wouldn't be nearly as bad as it was for them, because agriculture is only part of what we have. But agriculture was the whole thing for them. And what he's saying is, though the greatest possible disaster should come, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Dr. Campbell Morgan preached a sermon on this in his Westminster series of the Bible, I think it was. And he said, we have one word today that describes what Habakkuk is saying, and our word is bankruptcy. Though I go into bankruptcy, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. I'm afraid that word bankruptcy today doesn't mean quite as much as it used to mean. You know, some people, they go into bankruptcy under the bankruptcy law, and then they go right on in business. I don't understand that. You mean cancel all your debts and all, and then you go right on and make some more money? I don't understand it. Man told me that there was a certain firm in Colombia. They went into bankruptcy, but he said they were open for business the next day, and they went right on. I don't understand it. That's not my understanding of what the bankruptcy law is. Dr. Morgan says that's our nearest equivalent of this. Though we go into bankruptcy, yet we'll rejoice in the Lord, in the God of our salvation. I want you to write a couple of literal translations that Dr. Morgan gives. I feel free in quoting him about the meaning of the Hebrew word because he's a very careful student. Some people quote and say this is what the Hebrew means, and you say maybe. So, but when he tells you the Hebrew word means that, he's a very careful student. Especially is it true when he commits something like this to writing. I think when somebody commits a thing to writing, he's have to be more careful than when he just preaches orally. Because he preaches orally, and folks will forget that. But he's got it down in writing now, and they can hold it against him or for him, as the case may be. Over the word rejoice. Get out rejoice. Just write jump for joy. He says that's the literal Hebrew here. Yet I will jump for joy in joy. You mean though the greatest tragedy will come, yet I'll jump for joy. What you jumping about? See? Well, he tells you here, in the God of my salvation. See, that God's the God of my salvation. That's why I can jump for joy, no matter what comes. And then I will joy in the God of my salvation. Over the word joy, write spin around. He says that's the literal Hebrew. That I'll spin around in the God of my salvation. He's not talking here about an overwrought emotionalism. There is no overwrought emotionalism that just causes you to spin around and doesn't mean anything. No, it's not an overwrought emotionalism. But it's just a strong figure for the joy that he has. And then Dr. Morgan adds this. He says, I believe that one thing the church most sadly lacks today is exuberant, buoyant joy in the Lord God. Let me read that again. I believe that one thing the church most sadly lacks today is exuberant, buoyant joy in the Lord God. If a church isn't grown, there's a strong possibility and a strong probability that the members of that church don't have real joy in the Lord. It's a contagious type of thing. You realize that one of your greatest testimonies before the world will be that you're completely happy in the Lord no matter what happens. I don't like that idea of standing up before a group and say, now, everybody smile. Nobody smiling this time. I just hate that. Because that encourages unreality. You know, somebody tells me to smile. Say, brother, give me some material to smile about. And don't just ask me to put a Cheshire grin on my face and make me more hypocritical than I already am. Trying to smile. No, don't do that. But when people come and visit this church right here, do they get the idea that this is really a happy group in the Lord? Same thing would apply to our class. As you've been here in the class tonight, have you really rejoiced in the Lord? Have you been rejoicing in the Lord? Some of you don't look like you have. I can't tell. I can't tell whether you have or not. You know, you can stand up and fuss at people, and all, but fuss yourself. So like you don't know, sometimes people are so sleepy. You know, I was so sleepy too. I was so afraid I was going to go to sleep behind the wheel of my car when I went from the eating place. I had to go up to the bank. And you know, I was signing something there, and unwitting, I just put my head right down over there, and I was asleep. And it was about 4:05, and the bank was ready to close. The lady came on and there, she was anxious to know that I wasn't sick. I said, are you sick? No, lady, I'm just sleeping. I've taken a couple of no-doses. They haven't taken effect yet. Y'all ever take no-doses? We've got somebody who's going to take a trip tonight. He's going up to Pennsylvania. So we tried to bum some no-doses on them, but I wouldn't be bummed. But y'all ever go to each one of us drink a cup of coffee? And I do it sometimes now. Our sleeping schedule at home quite irregular. Sometimes we sleep in the daytime, sometimes we sleep at night. Just depends. See? And sometimes my buddy Love will call and say, "Love, will you help me with this and all?" I say, "Wait for taking no notice." You know, I sort of get waked up and somebody might see me and say, "Well, you're not rejoicing in the Lord." I tell you, I was so sleepy, I didn't know what I was doing. Tell you the truth. So I'm careful about that. But ask God as you come to your church service to fill your heart with His joy. His joy. Folks, that's an attractive thing. That's going to bring some other people in. And if a church isn't really growing, I believe it's because one of the main reasons is that people there aren't really happy in the Lord, no matter what comes. So let me read that quotation again. I believe that one thing the church most sadly lacks today is exuberant, buoyant joy in the Lord God. Even though bankruptcy comes, still rejoicing in the Lord. Jonathan Edwards, you know, was this mighty man of God who led the great revival in New England. After he died, Jonathan Edwards' wife, Everly, was a very devoted Christian. She said that when God took her husband, the Lord filled her heart with such joy in the Lord. She was afraid the neighbors would misunderstand. And she was afraid that the neighbors would think that she didn't really love her husband because she had such joy in the Lord. That doesn't mean tears are wrong. Tears aren't always wrong. You know, Jesus wept. 3 times you have Christ in tears. At the same time, you have that joy in the Lord. Have you even begun to experience that in your own Christian experience? Well, my eyes are fixed on the Lord. I'm on that watchtower of faith, and I'm going to know that no matter what happens. Suppose right after there was a verse in Psalms that said, "He shall not be afraid of evil tidings." His heart is fixed, trusting the Lord. Suppose you go right after this class, and right after this class you find out one of your dearest loved ones has died. What about that? Well, he shall not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is fixed, trusting the Lord. Remember the great illustration of that is Job. Remember, 4 messengers came to Job with evil tidings. I want to tell you, folks, every one of them, by the way, this 3rd chapter of Habakkuk goes right along with the book of Job. And each one of them brought a message that was enough to kill you. In fact, one messenger, one of the 4 messengers. And then you see the Bible says, while he was yet speaking. And then while he was yet speaking, and while he was yet speaking. And one messenger came and said, "Your 10 children have been killed by a cyclone." 10 children. Why? The person loses 1 child. What a tragedy. He lost the 10 on 1. 10 on 1. And then he said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." Blessed be the name of the Lord. I heard a very precious thing about Dr. Fleece, one of my spiritual fathers. Dr. Fleece's son, Ned, was killed in an automobile accident. They were down in Florida somewhere. He took his cousin, little girl cousin. They were driving somewhere, and she wasn't hurt. And he was killed. He said, pretty certain it just happened suddenly. Down there in Florida, you've got to be careful driving in that sand. That sand can really be treacherous. Oh, it can be treacherous. And the wheels were caught, so they waited for Ned to come back, and he didn't come. Finally, Dr. Police went out looking for him. And then one of the highway patrol came to tell Mrs. Police that I understand there's been quite a bad accident. He knew one boy got killed. You know, if I was involved like that, anybody's involved, you want to drop the news as carefully as you can. And so he took her to the funeral home, and Dr. Police was just coming out. See, how was he going to greet his wife? The Ned had been killed. He just greeted him with Job 1:21. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. And that's what Habakkuk no matter what comes, that's going to be one of your greatest testimonies before the Lord. I like the first way in which these verses are a wonderful conclusion to Habakkuk is that they record the climax of the prophet's faith. And then the second way in which they're a wonderful conclusion is that they give the answer to all the questions of life. Habakkuk's been asking questions of God. These words give the answers, and the answer to all the questions of life is God himself. It's a significant thing that in these closing verses you have the three great Hebrew names for God which are used. Just circle them in your notes. 3 or 4 lines from the bottom. God. That's Elohim, God of my salvation, meaning the mighty creator God. And then Jehovah. Jehovah means the ever-living God. And then Lord, that is Adonai, A-D-O-N-A-I, meaning the sovereign God, the one who rules. That's one way in which you encourage your faith, is through the titles of God. Don't just rush through them. Stop on those titles of God. They help to encourage your faith. And God, Elohim, mighty creator God. Jehovah, the ever-living God. And Lord Adonai, the sovereign God, the one who rules. That's the answer to all the questions Habakkuk has asked and all the questions anybody can ask. It's just God himself. God himself. On page 109, take our 8th principle, use the great songs and hymns of the Christian church to aid you in making the book of Habakkuk your own. I have 2 clincher songs. One is the great song of Ray Palmer, My Faith Looks Up to Thee. I love that song. Oh, how many of you know? You know that one? That's a great one. My faith looks up to Thee, Thou Lamb of Calvary, Savior divine. Now hear me while I pray, take all my guilt away. Oh, let me from this day be wholly thine. And the 3rd stanza is especially appropriate in terms of Habakkuk. Listen to the 3rd stanza. While life's dark maze I tread, and griefs around me spread, be thou my guide. Bid darkness turn today, wipe sorrow's tears away, nor let me ever stray from thee aside. Read that 3rd stanza again. That just gets you into the heart of the message of Habakkuk. While life's dark maze I tread, and griefs around me spread, be thou my guide. Bid darkness turn today, wipe sorrow's tears away, nor let me ever stray from thee aside. Then my 2nd clincher song is the great song of William Cowper. In England, they pronounce that Cooper, C-O-W-P-E-R. We pronounce it Cowper. He's the one who wrote the great hymn, There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins. My, that's a great hymn. Oh, I just love it. Sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stains. Generally speaking, these contemporary songs, I think, fall far short of those old timers. Old-timers are going to attempt to do contemporary songs. I don't think that's true. I believe it's true generally speaking. Doesn't mean God can't get depth today, but most of our contemporary music, I'm not just talking about the boogie-woogie stuff. We hear what it's called the poogie-poogie-doo type. The poogie-poogie-doo type of music and all. I'm not just talking about the poogie-poogie-doo type and all, but the just contemporary. You take the well-known song, How Great Thou Art. I still don't think that has the depth to it that some of these others. You think it do, you may not agree with it. I'll be glad for you to admit you're wrong, but no, opinions differ on some of these great old songs. William Cowper wrote that one, There is a Fountain Filled with Blood. Then he wrote another. That's the one I'm going to refer to, Winter Song. I wonder if you know what it is. You know what it is? That's it. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the deep and rides upon the storm. I want to read it. and then tell you the story that caused him to write it, and then come back and reread it. Blind unbelief is sure to err and search his works in vain. God is his own interpreter. Isn't that great? He'll make it plain. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are filled with mercy and shall break with blessing on your head. How many of you know that song? You know that song? If I come close enough? Here's how he wrote it. William Cowper was subject to fits of melancholy. Several times in life he tried to commit suicide. People have asked, can a born-again Christian take his own life? Well, you certainly know that most of those who take their own lives are not Christians. That's clear. Could a Christian do it? Well, William Cowper tried several times. He had these fits of melancholy. And on one particular occasion, it was a very rainy day, stormy day, and he hired a cab driver to take him out. Those were horse and buggy days. They weren't automobile days. It was the 18th century. Long before automobiles, I know that. And he hired a cab driver to take him out to the river. He's going to jump off and commit suicide. But somebody knew that William Cowper was in one of those fits of melancholia. So he called the cab driver aside and said, lose your way. If you lose your way, pretty soon you'll get over that bit of melancholia. So the cab driver did. He deliberately lost his way. Just on. A long time later, he found his way, and when he found his way, William Cowper wasn't ready to commit suicide. And then to commemorate God's deliverance, he wrote this song. Now just listen to it again. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the deep, rides upon the storm. Blind unbelief is sure to err, search his works in vain. God is his own interpreter, he'll make it plain. You fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are filled with mercy and shall break with blessing on your head. Let's have our closing. You ask the Lord to write this on your heart. In the midst of bankruptcy, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Jesus' precious